Recognized as a linguist and a political philosopher, and it's obvious that you're very passionate about your work. I was wondering, where does the energy come from to pursue these passions so thoroughly and diligently?
I don't know, just seems the natural way to be. I never really asked the question. Involved and engaged in the work. There are plenty of external stimuli, so in both sides. So on the sort of professional side, there are very challenging and exciting problems, and they're just engaging, so it's fun to work on them. On the human affairs side, there are just overwhelming human problems, tragedies, ominous developments that just sort of, I don't see how you can avoid becoming seriously engaged in them.
How are media and language changing, and how have they kind of changed from the past, and what effect do you feel this has on society?
Media are changing, right, in a number of directions. For one thing, I'm very critical of the media, but I should say that I think that they are less subordinate, reflexively subordinate to power than they used to be in what's considered, the grand old days, Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow, and so on. They were very subordinate to power, rarely asked any questions. Now there's some questioning. Now that's not a reflection of anything internal to the media. It's a reflection of the culture. And the society became much more civilized as a result mainly of the activism of the 60s and its aftermath. There's a lot of illustrations of that, and that's affected the media too. On the other hand, there's a counterforce. Any time in history that there's a kind of a civilizing effect, which typically does mean questioning of authority, power, domination, asking it to justify itself, there's always going to be a counterreaction, an effort to beat it back, restore obedience, passivity, and authority, and that's going on too. And we're caught between these forces. And it shows up in all kinds of ways, including the media. So the media perform in a fashion which actually is going to end up destroying civilization. And you can see it in today's non-news. So this morning, just to illustrate, an important poll was released by the Pew Research Center, one of the main, most respected polling organizations. They've been regularly monitoring popular attitudes towards environmental concerns, global warming, and so on. And this morning's poll was quite ominous. I didn't see it reported in the New York Times, the only newspaper I looked at. Maybe it's elsewhere. The poll this morning showed that on the question, do humans contribute to global warming, the proportion was never very high, but it suffered a precipitous decline in the last year or so. It's now barely over a third of the population. Okay, that's a death sentence for the species.
Sure.
And
why do you think
that's because of the way things are presented to us.
Mm-hmm. So why do you think that it's changed, the viewpoints changed on environmental issues?
I think it's on this. Mm-hmm. Well, it's coming from a drumbeat of propaganda originating essentially in the business world, which is where most propaganda comes from, and being transmitted through various channels, talk radio, Fox News, and so on. And by the so-called liberal media, there's no real response. It's treated as just, there's a dispute. There's a dispute. Yeah, there's a dispute about whether the world was created 10,000 years ago or, maybe 15 billion years ago, and we just present both sides. Well, okay, that means there's no response. And what you get on the one hand is a major, extensive drumbeat of propaganda saying it's all a hoax. On the other hand, you have maybe look it up in Science magazine or a couple of technical articles here and there, and the media treat it as if it's debate. And yes, that's where you get these effects. Now, if we were serious, if we had media that were really doing their job, they'd point out that there's a deeper reason for all of this. I mean, why does Exxon or the American Petroleum Institute or the Chamber of Commerce, big business lobby, why do they want to induce the belief that it's all unimportant? Well, that's because of a fundamental inefficiency of markets, a deep inefficiency of markets, which you may study in, Ec 101, but people don't pay much attention to it. Market transactions do not take into account what are called externalities, the effects on others. So like if you sell me a car, we may make a deal that's good for the two of us, but we don't we don't take into account the effect of the transaction on others. And there's an effect, congestion, pollution, and so on, but we don't price that in. Now, okay, that's just you and me, but when it extends to, the major business corporations, it becomes huge. So Goldman Sachs, for example, does not take into account what's called systemic risk, the effect of a risky investment on the system. That's why we have a financial crisis. The energy corporations don't take into account the fact that they're going to destroy the possibilities for a decent survival. That's just not a calculation. The calculation is, let's make the business deals that we can reach tomorrow. Now, that's built into markets. And if we're going to, we have a limited reliance on markets in our society, economic system. It's by no means total, but it's limited. It's there. And to the extent that it's there and it's not constrained, it's a recipe for disaster.
What, in your view, is the responsibility of journalists and the media, and what can we do to better encourage them to meet these responsibilities?
For media and journalists who have some respect for the freedom that we enjoy, they should be putting these things in headlines. I mean, you shouldn't have to wait until there's a video interview to find out about the, say, Pew poll and the fundamental market inefficiencies that lie behind it and govern the efforts of the energy corporations and the propaganda. I mean, that should be a front page story.
This should be a dialogue we're having.
Same with every other example we mentioned, and you can go on and on. But that's a lot to expect. For one thing, if a journalist tried to do this, he'd be out of a job pretty soon. The media are power systems. It's not a secret. They're corporations. They're part of the general corporate structure, which is tightly linked to state power. The journalists themselves are people like us, educated people, came from good universities. They're in the midst of an academic and intellectual culture which is itself subordinate to power and reproduces a picture of the world that's acceptable, tolerant to power in many, many ways. A ton of documentation about this. So it's partly just internalized, and partly it's the structure of the institutions. Responsibility of people, journalists or anyone else, is to challenge the institutions to the extent that they can't justify themselves. And these are among the innumerable examples. Touch anywhere you like and you find one.
I was wondering, how do you stay informed, and where do you get your news and your information from?
Well, how to stay informed. There's no magic keys about all of this. It's just hard work. If you work hard, you get well informed. Of course, you have to know what you're looking for. I mean, you can't just say roam the internet and think you're going to learn something. I mean, you may pick up a collection of factoids, half of which are false, but if you want to understand a topic, you have to have a framework of understanding to begin with. So suppose you're a scientist, say a biologist. The best biologist is not say the woman who just won the Nobel Prize. She didn't get there by reading all the biological journals that appear. If she did that, she'd never do anything else. You have to know what you're looking for, and you pick out things that sort of strike a chord, and you pursue them, and you look for other things that relate to them. It can lead you on the wrong track. So if you're rational, you're always willing to backtrack, say, well, I went the wrong way. But unless you have a substantial framework of internal comprehension, what you do is useless. That's one of the reasons why the internet so quickly turns into a cult generator. You know, somebody puts up a wild idea, and somebody else picks it up and says, yeah, maybe, and pretty soon you have people from all over the world pursuing it. You have to know what you're looking for, and it can be wrong, in which case you have to rethink. So you have to have a little residue of skepticism all the time and self-examination, but there's no other way to proceed.
Kind of going back to the second part of that question, is there anything we can do to encourage them to meet that responsibility, to challenge power, other institutions, you know, whether they be corporate or government, to ask them to rise to that challenge better?
What we're doing right now, and any other occasion that arises, you know. I mean, but really, to do it as an individual is, you know, almost kind of meaningless. You can't do much as an individual. What you can do a lot as an organization. That's why there has been such massive efforts to atomize the society, to break it apart. You know, so you have individual atoms, kind of the optimal social system as units with you and the tube and nothing else, you know. So no unions, no political organizations, no political parties, no you know, anything you can think of, because they're dangerous. When people get together, they start to interact, they start to have ideas, they figure out ways to do things. I mean, like I teach in a science university, MIT. It's a cooperative institution. Scientific work is very rarely done individually. You expect your graduate students to stand up and tell you you're wrong and give you reasons. And you expect to work jointly with colleagues and students. That's why if you take a look at the Nobel Prizes, for example, you'll find that they're almost always group activities. Well, yeah, that's the way you can learn how to think. That's the way you get ideas. That's the way you learn how to implement them. It's preserved in the sciences because they wouldn't survive otherwise. But it's almost destroyed in the outside community with major efforts. I mean, that's why unions are so despised, and there's such enormous efforts to destroy unions, because they are among the, you know, all kind of things wrong with them, but they're among the few social institutions that are really popular. They bring people together with common concerns, people who are individually pretty much powerless, but joined together can have a lot of influence and effect. Sure. That's, in fact, look back at the progressive legislation over the years, that's mostly where it comes from. So sure, there's every effort to destroy them.
That makes a lot of sense. Going back a little bit to the educators, is there a special role or responsibility that educated people, educators have, and perhaps students as well?
I mean, you know, people like us, educators, you know, call ourselves educators or students. I mean, we're very privileged as compared with the general population, not just in income, I don't mean that, but in freedom, in resources, in, you know, access to information and opportunities to choose what we're going to do. You know, this is an unusually privileged existence. I mean, you know, people don't like, maybe in the field, don't think they're working very hard, and maybe they are. Like maybe you're working 80 hours a week, but it's your 80 hours mostly. You're going where you, and that's a huge thing. So we're very privileged. And privilege just confers responsibility, confers opportunity, confers responsibility. Then comes an individual decision. Do I want to meet it or not? In history, that there's a kind of a civilizing effect, which typically does mean questioning of authority, power, domination, you know, asking it to justify itself. There's always going to be a counter-reaction, an effort to beat it back, restore obedience, passivity, and authority, and that's going on too. And we're caught between these forces. And it shows up in all kinds of ways, including the media. So, you know, the grand old days, Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow, and so on, they were very subordinate to power, rarely asked any questions. Now there's some questioning. Now that's not a reflection of anything internal to the media. It's a reflection of the culture. And the society became much more civilized as a result mainly of the activism of the 60s and its aftermath. There's a lot of illustrations of that, and that's affected the media too. On the other hand, there's a counterforce. Anytime.
How are media and language changing, and how have they kind of changed from the past? And what effect do you feel this has on society?
Media are changing in a number of directions. For one thing, I'm very critical of the media, but I should say that I think that they're less subordinate, reflexively subordinate to power than they used to be in what's considered of external stimuli, so in both sides. So on the sort of professional side, there are very challenging and exciting problems, and they're just engaging, so it's fun to work on them. On the human affairs side, there are just overwhelming human problems, tragedies, ominous developments that just sort of, I don't see how you can avoid becoming seriously engaged in them.
Recognized as a linguist and a political philosopher, and it's obvious that you're very passionate about your work. I was wondering, where does the energy come from to pursue these passions so thoroughly and diligently?
I don't know, just seems the natural way to be. I never really asked the question. Involved and engaged in the work. There are plenty